The twin suns of Tatooine blazed mercilessly over the endless dunes, their white-hot light bleaching the sand to a pale cream that shimmered with heat waves. In the vast emptiness of the Jundland wastes, where moisture farmers struggled to coax life from barren rock and ancient Tusken raiders wandered like ghosts of a forgotten age, a child was born into destiny. Not in the gleaming towers of Coruscant, not in the marble halls of Naboo's royal palace, not even in the proud corridors of a star cruiser soaring through hyperspace, but in shadow, in secret, in a dimly lit medical facility, on an asteroid called Polis Massa, where the screams of his mother echoed through sterile chambers as she brought forth twins with her dying breath. Luke Skywalker entered the galaxy as his mother departed it, as the Republic crumbled into empire, as the Jedi were hunted to extinction across 1,000 worlds. His first cries mingled with Padme Amidala's final words, her voice barely a whisper as she insisted there was still good in the father Luke would never know, the fallen Jedi, who had become the Empire's dark enforcer. The medical droids worked frantically, their mechanical arms precise but powerless to save the senator who had lost the will to live, whose heart had been shattered not by physical injury but by the weight of loving a man who had become a monster. Obi-Wan Kenobi held the infant with trembling hands, this small bundle of potential wrapped in simple cloth, blue eyes blinking up at the bearded Jedi Master who had failed to save the boy's father from darkness. The weight of that failure pressed down on Obi-Wan's shoulders like the gravity of a collapsing star. He had trained Anakin Skywalker, had called him brother, had fought beside him through the Clone Wars, and had been forced to leave him burning and mutilated on the black sands of Mustafar. Now he held Anakin's son, feeling the Force flowing through the child like a river of pure light, and knew that the boy represented either the galaxy's greatest hope or its final doom. Senator Bail Organa took the girl, Leia, promising to raise her as his daughter on Alderaan, to give her every advantage of nobility and education. But Luke would go to Tatooine, to the very world where his father had been born into slavery, where Shmi Skywalker had dreamed of freedom for her mysterious son who had no father, who had been conceived by the Force itself, according to the old legends. The circle would turn, as circles always do. Obi-Wan would take the boy to Owen and Beru Lars, moisture farmers who had never wanted anything to do with Jedi or their wars, who wanted only to work their vaporators and survive another season in the Outer Rim's harshest environment. The Lars homestead squatted half buried in the sand like a bunker against the desert's fury, its moisture vaporators standing sentinel against the horizon like skeletal sentries. The homestead's entrance was a blast door set into the sand, opening onto steps that descended into the relative cool of underground chambers carved from sandstone. Here, in rooms lit by yellow glow panels, with walls bearing the wear of wind-blown sand and the stains of hard water, Luke Skywalker grew from infant to boy to young man. Uncle Owen was stern, his face weathered to leather by twin suns and constant worry, his hands calloused from a lifetime of machinery repair and vaporator maintenance. He loved the boy but feared him too, feared what ran in his blood, what power might awaken if Luke ever learned the truth about his father. Aunt Beru was gentler, her eyes soft with maternal affection, her touch tender as she bandaged Luke's scraped knees and soothed his childhood nightmares. She would watch the boy stare at the sunset, seeing something in his distant gaze that frightened her, a hunger for something beyond the horizon, a yearning that reminded her too much of stories Owen had told about his stepbrother Anakin, who had left Tatooine as a slave child and returned briefly as a Jedi Knight, only to disappear into legend and rumor. Luke's childhood was one of chores and dreams, of moisture farming and stargazing, of mechanical aptitude and frustrated restlessness. He would wake before dawn when the desert was still cool and dark, when the stars blazed overhead in their millions, and help Uncle Owen check the vaporators for the precious condensation that meant survival. The machines hummed and clicked, their collection units filling drop by precious drop with water extracted from Tatooine's parched atmosphere. It was tedious work, endless work, the kind of work that bent backs and broke spirits across generations. Luke learned to repair motivators and replace power couplings, to diagnose malfunctions by sound alone, to jury-rig solutions with whatever spare parts could be scavenged from Tosche Station or bartered from passing Jawas. The Jawas would appear without warning, their sandcrawler moving across the dunes like a mobile fortress, their glowing eyes peering from beneath brown robes as they haggled in their incomprehensible language, spreading their wares on salvage tarps, droids, parts, mysterious devices from crashed ships and abandoned settlements. Luke became fluent in the language of machinery, understanding the relationship between power cells and circuits, between hydraulics and servos, between the elegant engineering of the Old Republic and the crude but effective technology of the Outer Rim. But machines were not enough to satisfy the hunger in his heart. At night, after the work was done and the moisture sealed in storage tanks, Luke would climb to the surface and stare at the stars. He would trace constellations he had memorized from old datacrons, imagining the worlds that orbited those distant suns. Coruscant, the galactic capital, where billions lived in city spires that reached towards space. Corellia, where the finest starships were built in orbital shipyards. Naboo, with its waterfalls and green hills. Alderaan, peaceful and cultured, a beacon of art and diplomacy. These worlds existed only in his imagination, constructed from fragmentary transmissions and old holonet broadcasts, from stories told by traders and spacers who stopped at Anchorhead Cantina, from his own desperate need to believe that somewhere beyond Tatooine's wasteland there was meaning, purpose, adventure. His friends mocked his dreams. Biggs Darklighter, his best friend since childhood, understood better than the others, but still found Luke's intensity amusing. "Easy there, Luke," Biggs would say, his laughter warm and affectionate. "The galaxy isn't going anywhere." But Luke felt time slipping away, felt himself becoming like his uncle, capable, reliable, trapped. He would be a moisture farmer like Owen, would marry some local girl, would have children who would stare at the same stars with the same hopeless yearning, generation after generation bound to the sand. The Force was with him, though he did not know its name. It flowed through him in moments of intuition, guiding his hands as he piloted his T-16 Skyhopper through Beggar's Canyon, navigating by instinct alone through ravines, where sensor readings came too late to prevent crashes. His friends said he had the best reflexes they'd ever seen, reactions impossibly fast, as if he knew where obstacles would be before he reached them. Luke attributed it to practice, to countless hours flying through the canyon system, threading his Skyhopper between rock walls at speeds that made his passengers scream with terror and exhilaration. He would hunt womp rats for sport, targeting the aggressive creatures with his Skyhopper's laser cannons, boasting that he could hit targets no bigger than 2 meters even at high speed. The targeting computer helped, but Luke often flew with it switched off, trusting something deeper than technology, some inner voice that told him when to fire, when to bank, when to pull up from a dive that looked suicidal. Uncle Owen worried about these flights, forbade them when he found out, but Luke would slip away anyway, unable to resist the call of speed and sky, the brief freedom of flight that lifted him above the mundane reality of moisture farming. Years passed in this limbo of unfulfilled potential. Luke grew taller, his frame filling out with the lean muscle that came from physical labor, his sandy hair bleached lighter by constant sun exposure, his blue eyes reflecting the same restless energy that had burned in his father before him. He was 19 years old, standing on the threshold of a life he didn't want, when fate arrived in the form of 2 droids stumbling across the dune sea. It was the season for purchasing new equipment, and Uncle Owen needed droids to help with the harvest season's increased workload. The Jawas arrived with their usual cacophony of mechanical chattering and pungent odor, their sandcrawler's cargo hold packed with scavenged machines of varying quality and functionality. Among the units they displayed was a battered astromech droid, white and blue, its dome scarred and dusty, bearing the designation R2-D2. The little droid seemed almost frantic, its mechanical sounds carrying an urgency that protocol droids translated as distress. Owen selected a protocol droid first, C-3PO, gold-plated and anxiety-prone, who immediately began complaining about the sand getting into his joints. For the astromech, Owen initially chose a red R5 unit, but before the transaction could be completed, the R5 developed a bad motivator, its systems failing in a puff of smoke and frustrated mechanical protests. R2-D2 rolled forward, as if volunteering for service, and Luke found himself advocating for the little droid despite its apparent battle damage. There was something about it, something familiar though they had never met. something that called to him on a level he couldn't articulate. Uncle Owen agreed reluctantly, and the droids were taken back to the homestead's workshop for cleaning and preparation. Luke set to work with the solvent and tools, wiping away layers of sand and grime, while C-3PO chattered incessantly about their adventures that seemed remarkably extensive for mere utility droids. R2-D2 remained silent, almost watchful, as Luke cleaned its casing and checked its systems. Then, as Luke worked on a panel near the droid's holographic projector, something triggered, the workshop filled with blue light, and a figure appeared hovering above the astromech, a young woman, beautiful and desperate, her form transparent and shimmering. "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi," she said, her voice distorted by the recording's age and the droid's failing systems. "You're my only hope." The message looped, fragmentary and incomplete, the woman's image flickering like a ghost pleading from across the void. Luke's heart hammered in his chest. The woman was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, though she was only light and data. A holographic phantom, but more than her beauty, it was her desperation that called to him, the raw need in her voice, the sense that she represented something real and urgent happening somewhere beyond Tatooine's isolation. Who was she? Who was Obi-Wan Kenobi? C-3PO claimed not to know, insisted the droid belonged to a Captain Antilles now, suggested the message was old and irrelevant. But Luke knew better. He felt it in his bones, in his blood, in that nameless instinct that guided him through Beggar's Canyon. This was important. This meant something. R2-D2 refused to play the complete message, claimed a restraining bolt was inhibiting its functions, insisted it must deliver the message to someone named Obi-Wan. Luke mentioned the name to his uncle at dinner, asking casually if there was anyone by that name nearby, perhaps in the hills. Owen's reaction was immediate and sharp. "That's a name I've not heard in a long time," he said, his voice tight with old anger and older fear. He dismissed the idea, claimed Obi-Wan was dead, changed the subject with obvious discomfort. But Aunt Beru corrected him quietly. "He's not dead, not yet." And Luke saw the look that passed between them, weighted with secrets and long-buried history. That night, Luke's dreams were troubled. He saw starfields and battles, felt the weight of destiny pressing down on him like atmospheric pressure. When morning came, R2-D2 was gone. The little droid had removed its restraining bolt and escaped into the desert, rolling away on a mission Luke didn't fully understand but felt compelled to follow. Uncle Owen was furious at the loss, but practical necessity overrode anger. The droid had to be recovered, it represented a significant investment, and it knew the location of the homestead. Luke volunteered to search, taking C-3PO along for translation and assistance, climbing into his landspeeder with a mixture of frustration and secret exhilaration. This was an adventure, even a small one, an excuse to leave the homestead and explore the rocky badlands where Tusken raiders lurked. He found R2-D2 making its way across the rocky terrain with single-minded determination, heading deeper into territory that made C-3PO shriek with alarm about raiders and dangerous creatures. Luke scolded the droid, was preparing to haul it back to the speeder, when movement on the rocks above drew his attention. The Tusken raider appeared silhouetted against the sky, its rapt face and violent motion recognizable even at a distance. The Sand People attacked with their gadafai sticks and projectile weapons, their war cries echoing off stone. Luke fell, struck by a blow that sent him tumbling into darkness. He woke to a weathered face looming over him, framed by a rough-spun hood, eyes that were ancient and sad peering down with concern. "Easy now," the old man said, his voice carrying the educated accent of the core worlds mixed with years of Outer Rim solitude. "You've had a bit of a nasty bump." The Tusken raiders were gone, frightened away by something, a sound the old man had made, something primal that had sent them scrambling into the rocks. Luke sat up, head aching, and stared at his rescuer. This was Ben Kenobi, the hermit who lived beyond the Dune Sea, the crazy wizard whom local kids whispered about and local adults dismissed. But Luke saw something else now, something he had missed in all his years of occasionally spotting the old man at Anchorhead or hearing stories about his eccentricity. He saw power, contained but present, and recognition that went beyond their few casual encounters. "Do you know someone named Obi-Wan Kenobi?" Luke asked, and watched the old man's expression shift through layers of memory and pain. "Obi-Wan Kenobi," Ben repeated slowly, as if tasting a name he had not spoken aloud in many years. Now that's a name I've not heard in a long time. A long time. Then he smiled, sad and gentle. Of course I know him. He's me. In Ben's modest home, carved into the rock of the canyon walls, surrounded by humble furnishings and mysterious artifacts, Luke's universe shattered and reformed. Ben played the full message, Princess Leia's desperate plea filling the small space with urgency and purpose. She was calling for help, pleading for Obi-Wan to come to Alderaan, to assist her father in the rebellion's darkest hour, to bring the stolen Death Star plans, hidden within R2-D2's memory banks, to those who could use them against the Empire. Luke listened with growing amazement, his mind struggling to process concepts that had been abstract until this moment: the rebellion, the Empire's superweapon, the reality of the conflict that he had experienced only through censored news broadcasts and rumors. But more than the message, more than the beautiful princess calling from across the stars, it was what Ben told him next that tore away the foundations of everything Luke had believed about himself. Your father, Ben said quietly, reaching for something stored in an old chest, was a Jedi Knight, and a good friend. He produced a weapon, an elegant cylinder of metal that hummed to life in his hands, projecting a blade of pure blue energy that cast everything in azure light. This is your father's lightsaber, an elegant weapon for a more civilized age. Luke held the lightsaber, felt its weight and balance, activated it, and heard its musical hum filling the space around him. The blade was light itself, pure energy contained by magnetic fields, impossibly sharp and perfectly stable. He swung it experimentally, and the weapon moved as if it had mass and momentum far beyond its physical weight, as if it was connected to something deeper than steel and plasma. Ben told him about the Jedi, the ancient order of peacekeepers who had served the Old Republic for 1,000 generations, who had been the guardians of justice and stability across the galaxy. He spoke of the Force, the energy field created by all living things, binding the galaxy together, giving the Jedi their power, the ability to sense intentions, to move objects with thought alone, to perceive the future in fragmentary visions. He spoke of Anakin Skywalker, Luke's father, who had been a cunning warrior and a good friend, who had been betrayed and murdered by Darth Vader, the Emperor's dark enforcer. The story was a lie, but Luke didn't know that yet. He heard only that his father had been a great man, a hero, someone worth emulating. Uncle Owen had told him his father was a navigator on a spice freighter, nothing special, dead before Luke was born. But this was a legacy worth claiming. Ben asked Luke to come with him to Alderaan, to learn the Force and become a Jedi like his father, to help deliver R2-D2's message and the Death Star plans to the rebellion. For one shining moment, Luke wanted to say yes with every fiber of his being. Adventure, purpose, meaning, everything he had craved was being offered on a silver platter, but fear and obligation held him back. Uncle Owen needed him for the harvest. The homestead required another season's work before Luke could leave with good conscience. He refused. Though the word tasted like ashes in his mouth, he offered to take Ben to Anchorhead to help him find passage off-world, but claimed he couldn't go himself, not now, not yet, maybe next season, when the harvest was complete and he could leave without guilt. Ben's disappointment was palpable but understanding. They left the hermit's home, loading the droids into Luke's landspeeder, heading back toward civilization. Then Luke saw the smoke. A dark column rising from the direction of the homestead, visible from kilometers away, thick and black against the blue sky. His heart froze in his chest, and he pushed the landspeeder to maximum speed, racing across the sand with a sick certainty already forming in his gut. The homestead was burning. Imperial stormtroopers had come searching for the droids, had interrogated Owen and Beru about their purchase from the Jawas, and had left nothing but death and fire behind. Luke found them outside the entrance, their bodies smoking and charred, reduced to blackened shapes barely recognizable as human. The smell of burning flesh and melted moisture vaporators filled his nose, and for a moment his mind simply refused to process what he was seeing. These had been his parents in all the ways that mattered, the people who had raised him and fed him and loved him despite their fears. Aunt Beru, who had bandaged his skinned knees and told him stories. Uncle Owen, who had taught him the value of honest work and self-reliance. Dead, murdered, reduced to carbon and ash because they had been tangentially connected to droids carrying secrets the Empire wanted suppressed. Luke fell to his knees in the sand, grief and rage warring in his chest, tears carving channels through the dust on his face. Everything he had known was gone, burned away in an afternoon, leaving only emptiness and the acrid smell of destruction. There was nothing keeping him on Tatooine now. No family, no obligation, no future. The homestead was destroyed, his relatives dead, his old life reduced to smoking rubble and painful memory. When he returned to where Ben waited with the droids, Luke's decision was made. "I want to come with you to Alderaan," he said, his voice steady despite the grief choking him. "I want to become a Jedi like my father. There's nothing here for me now." Ben nodded, accepting what had been inevitable from the moment R2 had arrived at the Lars homestead. The Force had set events in motion, and the galaxy would turn on the choices Luke made from this point forward. They would need passage off-world, which meant going to Mos Eisley Spaceport, that wretched hive of scum and villainy where smugglers and criminals gathered to trade in goods and services beyond the Empire's official channels. Ben warned Luke to be careful, to sell his land speeder quickly and draw no attention. They entered the spaceport with hoods drawn, 2 droids and 2 travelers among hundreds in the crowded streets, heading for Chalmun's cantina, where smugglers advertised their services. The cantina was dark and loud, filled with the stench of alcohol and unwashed bodies. With music provided by a modal nodes band playing energetic Jizwailers tunes, aliens of every description crowded the bar and tables. Aqualish and Rhodians, Duros and Deveronians, species Luke had never seen before except in old datacrons. A bar fight nearly erupted when 2 thugs took exception to Luke's presence, drawing weapons and making threats, but Ben's lightsaber resolved the situation with surgical precision, severing a limb and establishing that these travelers were not to be trifled with. In the aftermath, Ben found their transport Captain Han Solo of the Millennium Falcon, a young Corellian smuggler with a cocky grin and a walking carpet of a first mate. Solo drove a hard bargain, demanding 10,000 credits up front and another 5 on delivery to Alderaan. It was an outrageous sum, but Ben agreed, knowing they had little choice. Solo promised his ship was fast, the fastest in the fleet, boasting about the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs, a nonsensical claim that nevertheless spoke to his confidence and his ship's capabilities. They agreed to meet at Docking Bay 94, where the Millennium Falcon waited to carry them away from Tatooine. The journey to the docking bay became a running battle when stormtroopers spotted them and opened fire. Luke experienced combat for the first time, blaster bolts searing past his head close enough to feel their heat, the acrid smell of ozone and scorched stone filling his nostrils. His instincts took over, something deeper than conscious thought guiding him to duck and dodge, to find cover and return fire with the blaster Ben thrust into his hands. The weapon felt wrong in his grip, not elegant like the lightsaber, but brutal and effective. Each shot sent a bolt of coherent light, screaming toward their pursuers, and Luke found that his targeting instincts translated well to handheld weapons. They fought their way to the docking bay where the Millennium Falcon sat, waiting a battered Corellian light freighter that looked like it might fall apart on takeoff, all mismatched hull plates and modified systems. Solo was already firing up the engines. Chewbacca the Wookiee roaring orders in his incomprehensible language, both clearly experienced in hasty departures. Luke and Ben scrambled aboard with the droids just as more stormtroopers arrived, pouring fire into the docking bay. The Falcon's ramp closed with a hydraulic hiss, and the ship lifted on repulsor lifts, banking hard as it climbed toward the sky. The escape from Tatooine was violent and exhilarating. Imperial Star Destroyers were in orbit, massive wedge-shaped capital ships bristling with weapons, their turbo-laser batteries tracking the fleeing freighter. Solo piloted with reckless skill, threading between incoming fire, his hands dancing across the controls as he pushed the Falcon through evasive maneuvers that slammed Luke against his restraints. Chewbacca worked the shield controls, routing power from auxiliary systems to keep the deflector screens strong enough to absorb glancing hits. Luke watched through the cockpit viewport as Tatooine fell away beneath them, the desert world that had been his prison and home, becoming a tan sphere shrinking against the black of space. TIE fighters launched from the Star Destroyer's hangar bays, their distinctive twin-iron engines screaming as they accelerated toward the Falcon on intercept vectors. Solo cursed and armed the ship's quad-laser cannons, yelling for Luke to man the dorsal turret while he handled the flying. Luke climbed into the gun well, seating himself in the rotating chair, gripping the targeting controls with sweating hands. The targeting computer painted friendly silhouettes on his display, tracking the incoming fighters as they opened fire with their own lasers. Luke squeezed the triggers, and the Falcon's guns spat coherent light toward the enemy. His shots went wide, the targeting computer lagging behind the fighter's movements. He felt frustration rising, felt the same inadequacy he'd experienced watching Biggs and his other friends talk about joining the Imperial Academy while he remained trapped on his uncle's farm. Then Ben's voice came through the internal comm, calm and centered. "Remember, Luke, the Force will be with you. Trust your feelings." Luke closed his eyes for just a moment, reaching for something he couldn't name, letting go of conscious thought and allowing instinct to guide him. When he opened his eyes again, the targeting computer seemed irrelevant. He could feel where the TIE fighters would be, could sense their movements before they made them. His hands moved smoothly on the controls, tracking and firing in a rhythm that felt natural as breathing. A fighter exploded into debris as his shots found their mark, then another, their solar panels spinning away as containment failed and their reactors overloaded. Solo whooped with approval, and Chewbacca roared satisfaction. More TIE fighters closed in, their numbers seeming endless, but the distance between the Falcon and the Star Destroyer was increasing. Solo's fingers flew over the navicomputer, calculating their jump to hyperspace, waiting for the system to plot a safe course away from Tatooine's gravity well. The moment the computer chimed confirmation, Solo pulled back on the hyperdrive lever. The stars stretched into lines, and the universe twisted around them as they leapt into hyperspace, leaving the Empire behind. The journey to Alderaan would take hours, time measured in the strange elastic way of hyperspace, where distance and duration became abstract concepts. Luke left the gun turret and found Ben in the main hold, where the old Jedi was setting up a training remote, a small spherical droid that floated at eye level, its single optical sensor glowing red. Ben held out the lightsaber, Anakin's lightsaber, and gestured for Luke to take it. "Your first lesson," Ben said, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 years of Jedi tradition. He activated the training remote, and it began to circle Luke, moving erratically, then suddenly fired a sting bolt, not deadly but painful, designed to teach through negative reinforcement. Luke tried to deflect it with the lightsaber, moving the blade where his eyes told him the bolt would be, but the shot slipped past his guard and stung his thigh, making him yelp and jump back. Solo laughed from where he watched, leaning against the bulkhead with arms crossed. "Hokey religions and ancient weapons are no match for a good blaster at your side, kid," he said, his tone dismissive. But Ben ignored the smuggler, focusing on Luke with the intensity of a teacher who knew time was short and the lessons critical. "Your eyes can deceive you," Ben explained, producing a helmet with a blast shield that would cover Luke's vision. "Don't trust them. Stretch out with your feelings." Luke hesitated, fear of the unknown warring with desire to learn, to become something more than a farm boy with dead parents and broken dreams. He lowered the blast shield, and darkness swallowed his vision. The world disappeared, leaving only sound, the hum of the lightsaber, the ambient noise of the ship, his own breathing loud in his ears. The training remote fired again, and Luke swung blindly, missing completely, taking another sting on his arm that made him curse. "Concentrate," Ben urged. "Feel the Force flowing through you. Let it guide your actions." Luke tried again, forcing his breathing to slow, his mind to quiet. In the darkness behind the blast shield, something else opened, not sight exactly, but awareness. He felt the remote's position, felt its intention to fire before the shot came. His hands moved without conscious direction, the lightsaber intercepting the bolt and deflecting it away. The remote fired again and again, and each time Luke's blade was there, guided by something deeper than reflexes, by the Force flowing through him like a river he'd never noticed before. When he finally removed the helmet, Ben was smiling with satisfaction and something else, recognition, perhaps, or memory of another student who had shown the same natural aptitude. The hours passed in a strange suspension between old life and new. Luke practiced with the lightsaber, his muscles burning from unfamiliar movements, his mind expanding to accommodate concepts that would have seemed like fantasy days ago. Ben told him about the Jedi Order, about the Clone Wars where his father had fought, about the betrayal that had destroyed the Order and left the survivors scattered and hunted. He spoke in generalities, avoiding details that might reveal truths Luke wasn't ready to hear. Solo remained skeptical, dismissing talk of the Force as superstition, as the hokey religion of a dead culture. He and Chewbacca focused on their ship, making repairs and adjustments that seemed never-ending on a vessel held together by modifications and prayer. Luke found himself drawn to both teachers, Ben, who offered wisdom and purpose, Solo, who offered cynical pragmatism and street-smart survival skills. They were opposites in many ways, idealist and opportunist, believer and skeptic, but both represented freedoms Luke had never known. The hyperdrive hummed its steady song, carrying them closer to Alderaan, to Princess Leia, to whatever destiny awaited. Luke stood in the Falcon's main hold, lightsaber humming in his hands, feeling the Force like static electricity on his skin, and knew he was becoming something different, something his uncle would have feared and his father would have recognized. Then they emerged from hyperspace, and everything went wrong. Instead of the green orb of Alderaan floating peacefully in space, they found debris, massive chunks of planetary crust tumbling through the void, an asteroid field where a world had been. Solo's instruments screamed warnings about mass shadows and collision hazards, and he fought the controls to avoid impacts with chunks of rock the size of mountains. "What the hell happened here?" he demanded, his cocky confidence replaced by genuine shock. Ben staggered as if struck, his face draining of color, his hand gripping the back of a chair for support. "I felt a great disturbance in the Force," he whispered, his voice hollow with horror, as if millions of voices suddenly cried out in terror and were suddenly silenced. Luke stared at the debris field, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were showing him. A planet couldn't just disappear. Planets were permanent, eternal, the foundation upon which civilizations were built. But Alderaan was gone, obliterated, reduced to rubble and dust. Billions dead in an instant. And among them Luke thought of Princess Leia, her desperate holographic plea, wondered if she had been on her homeworld when it died, if her voice had been among those millions crying out. Before they could process the enormity of what they were witnessing, Solo spotted an Imperial fighter on their sensors. The small craft was headed away from their position, apparently hadn't spotted the Falcon yet, but it represented a thread that would lead the Empire directly to them. Solo wanted to flee back into hyperspace immediately, to run before they were identified. But the fighter changed course, and pursuit became inevitable. Solo cursed and locked the Falcon's weapons on target, preparing to destroy the fighter before it could report their presence. They closed rapidly, the fighter growing from a dot to a recognizable TIE fighter with its distinctive spherical cockpit and hexagonal panels. But as they approached, Luke noticed something wrong. The fighter was damaged, its flight erratic, and beyond it, something massive loomed in the void. It wasn't a fighter at all. He realized it was a short-range fighter dependent on a nearby base or carrier. And there, filling the viewport like a small moon, was that carrier. The Death Star. The battle station was beyond imagining, a sphere of steel and weapons systems measuring 160 kilometers in diameter, its surface covered with trenches and towers, with weapons emplacements and docking bays, with a terrible super laser dish that had just destroyed an entire world. Solo saw it and tried to abort, tried to veer away and jump to hyperspace before they were noticed, but the Death Star's tractor beam locked onto them with invisible fingers of directed gravity. The Falcon's engines strained against the pull, whining with overload, but it was useless. They were being reeled in like a fish on a line, drawn inexorably toward the station's massive docking bay. Solo killed the engines, knowing resistance was futile, his mind already working on escape plans. "They're going to scan for life forms," he said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "We're not going to last long against that Star Destroyer." Chewbacca growled agreement, his massive paws already moving toward the smuggling compartments built into the Falcon's deck plating. Solo had experience being boarded by Imperials, had designed contingencies into his ship for exactly this situation. They hid in the compartment's smuggling holds shielded against most sensors, cramped spaces barely large enough for humans and droids and a Wookiee, uncomfortable but hidden. Luke pressed against the wall of his compartment, lightsaber clutched in his hands, heart hammering so hard he thought surely it would give them away. They waited in darkness while stormtroopers boarded, their boots echoing on the Falcon's deck plates, their scanners sweeping for life signs. The officer in charge reported to someone called Commander, noting that the ship's log had been wiped and the crew was likely dead, abandoning ship in the confusion of Alderaan's destruction. It was plausible enough that the Imperials accepted it, leaving only a skeleton guard to watch the impounded vessel. When Solo finally emerged from hiding, his cocky grin was back despite the danger. "This is some rescue," he muttered, checking his blaster and assessing their situation. They couldn't stay hidden in the ship. Eventually someone would conduct a more thorough search. They needed to find a way off the station, needed to steal another ship or disable the tractor beam. Ben suggested they might do both if they could access the power terminals and lower the beam's power. Solo could fly the Falcon out while Ben dealt with the tractor beam controls. It was a terrible plan with 1,000 ways to fail, but it was the only plan they had. They stunned the guards left to watch the ship, stole their armor, the white plastoid shells that made stormtroopers anonymous and interchangeable, and ventured out into the Death Star's corridors. The battle station was a maze of grey metal and harsh lighting, of blast doors and security checkpoints, of countless identical corridors designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Luke wore the stormtrooper armor awkwardly, the helmet restricting his vision, the suit not quite fitting his frame. Solo moved with more confidence, his armor stolen from years of avoiding Imperial entanglements, his blaster hidden under the shell in case they needed to fight. They made their way toward a computer terminal where they could access the station's schematics, R2-D2 rolling along with them to slice into Imperial systems. The little droid plugged into a data port and began extracting information maps, security protocols, prisoner manifests. And there, buried in the detention-level records, was a name that made Luke's heart stop. Leia Organa, Princess of Alderaan, prisoner scheduled for termination. She was alive. Against all odds, the woman from the hologram was here, somewhere in this massive station, waiting to die. Luke grabbed Solo's arm, urgent and desperate. "We have to save her," he said. Solo looked at him like he was insane. "What? The princess? We're not going on some damn fool idealistic crusade. We're leaving." But Luke wouldn't let it go. He argued with passion born of hopelessness, reminding Solo that they needed every advantage they could get, that a princess would be worth a substantial reward to the rebellion, that leaving her to die would be cowardice. He didn't mention the real reason, the one he barely admitted to himself, that he had been drawn to her image from the first moment, that he felt connected to her through the Force in ways he couldn't articulate, that the thought of her dying alone in an Imperial cell while he ran to safety was unbearable. Solo resisted until Luke played his trump card. "She's rich, powerful. If we save her, you can name your price." Greed won where idealism had failed. Solo's eyes lit with avarice, and he grinned his rakish grin. "All right, kid, but you better be right about this." They split from Ben, who continued toward the tractor beam controls with a Jedi's serene confidence in the Force's will. Luke, Han, Chewbacca, and the droids headed for detention block AA-23, their stormtrooper disguises providing camouflage until they reached the security station. There, subtlety gave way to violence. Solo and Chewbacca opened fire on the startled officers, their blasters cutting down Imperials before alarms could be triggered. Luke raced to the cells, checking numbers until he found hers 2187. The cell door hissed open, and there she was. Not a hologram this time, but flesh and blood. Small and fierce in her white senatorial gown, her dark hair arranged in elegant side buns, her eyes blazing with defiance despite her imprisonment. She was beautiful. More beautiful than any holographic projection could capture. And for a moment, Luke could only stare. Then she spoke, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Aren't you a little short for a stormtrooper?" Luke fumbled with his helmet, pulling it off, revealing his face and his honest intentions. "I'm Luke Skywalker. I'm here to rescue you. I've got your R2 unit. I'm here with Ben Kenobi." The mention of Kenobi changed everything in her expression, skepticism replaced by hope, defiance by calculation. She was a princess, a leader in the rebellion, and she assessed situations with strategic precision. If Kenobi was here, then perhaps her message had gotten through, perhaps there was still hope. But her relief was short-lived. Alarms began blaring throughout the station, red lights flashing, and the sound of running boots echoing through corridors. Their cover was blown, and stormtroopers were converging on detention block AA-23 from every direction. The escape from the detention level became a running battle through corridors suddenly alive with enemy fire. Blaster bolts filled the air, ricocheting off metal walls, some finding flesh, and others splashing harmlessly against plastoid armor or deflecting from cover. Leia proved herself immediately, grabbing Luke's blaster and returning fire with accuracy that spoke of military training, her shots disciplined and effective. Solo and Chewbacca laid down suppressing fire while Luke tried to remember the escape route mapped from R2's stolen data. They retreated toward a dead-end corridor, trapped by advancing stormtroopers from both directions, blaster fire intensifying. Leia spotted a garbage chute and made the decision Solo and Luke were too panicked to consider. She blasted the chute open and dove in, sliding down into darkness. Luke and Solo followed with Chewbacca, the four of them tumbling through the chute and splashing down into something wet and foul-smelling. They had landed in a trash compactor, a room filled with years of accumulated garbage floating in murky water, the walls lined with metal plates designed to compress waste into manageable cubes for disposal. The compactor was dark and claustrophobic, lit only by emergency lighting that cast everything in sickly amber. Something moved in the water, something alive, something that had adapted to life in the Death Star's waste system. It grabbed Luke, pulling him under the surface before he could scream, its slimy body wrapping around his leg with horrifying strength. He fought against it blindly, unable to see his attacker, lungs burning as he was held underwater. Then the walls began to move, grinding inward with the sound of metal on metal, the compactor activating its crushing cycle. They were going to be pressed into a thin paste if they couldn't escape. Solo fired his blaster at the walls, but the bolts ricocheted dangerously in the confined space, nearly hitting Leia. Luke surfaced, gasping, the creature having released him for reasons unknowable, possibly sensing larger dangers in the moving walls. C-3PO's panicked voice came through their stolen comlinks. They needed R2 to shut down the compactor, needed the little droid to interface with the station's systems and override the crushing mechanism. The walls ground closer, water rising as the volume compressed, garbage pressing against them from all sides. Luke braced a metal pole between the walls, trying futilely to hold them back, his muscles straining against hydraulic force measured in tons. Then the walls stopped, mere seconds before impact, the grinding machinery falling silent. R2 had done it, slicing through Imperial security and saving their lives. They pried open the maintenance hatch and escaped the compactor, emerging into access corridors where they could breathe air that didn't reek of decay and bile. But they were still deep inside the Death Star, still hunted by thousands of stormtroopers, still impossibly far from safety. They fought their way back toward the Falcon's docking bay, moving through the station's guts, through access tunnels and service corridors where maintenance droids traveled and technicians worked. Leia took charge of their escape with natural command authority, directing their route with strategic instinct, berating Solo when his ego got in the way of survival. The smuggler and the princess clashed like flint and steel, their arguments sharp and heated. But beneath the antagonism, Luke sensed something else: attraction, perhaps, or recognition of similar spirits. They reached a chasm, a massive shaft dropping away into the Death Star's interior, crossed only by a retractable bridge that had been extended when they'd passed earlier, but was now retracted, leaving a gap of perhaps 20 meters. Stormtroopers were closing from behind, blaster fire forcing them forward despite the impossible gap. Luke's hand found a grappling device on his stolen belt, a magnetic hook with climbing cable. He activated it without thinking, without planning, pure instinct guiding his actions. The hook shot across the chasm and caught on structure on the far side, the cable going taut. He grabbed Leia, pulling her close, feeling her arms wrap around him, and swung them both across the gap as blaster bolts traced their arc through empty air. They landed on the far side in a tumble of limbs and breathless relief, and for just a moment their faces were inches apart, her eyes wide with adrenaline and something else. Then the moment passed, and they were scrambling to their feet, providing cover fire for Solo and Chewbacca to make their own crossing. The path to the Falcon was opening, bought with desperate action and impossible luck. But Luke felt a disturbance, a tremor in the Force that made his skin prickle with unnameable dread. Something was wrong. Somewhere in the station, Ben Kenobi had found the tractor beam controls and disabled them, making their escape possible. But he had also found something else, or something else had found him. In a corridor near the docking bay, two figures met. Obi-Wan Kenobi, aged but still graceful, his lightsaber blue and steady in his hands. And Darth Vader, Dark Lord of the Sith, towering and terrible in black armor. His breathing mechanical and ominous. His lightsaber red as blood and malice. They had been master and apprentice, brothers in all but blood, comrades through the Clone Wars, and partners in 1,000 battles. Now they were enemies. Separated by choices made and darkness embraced, by the gulf between light and shadow. Their lightsabers met with a shower of sparks and a sound like singing crystal, and they dueled with the skill of Jedi masters. Their movements precise and economical, each strike blocked and countered with minimal waste. But Obi-Wan was old, his body worn by years of desert exile, while Vader was more machine than man, augmented by technology that made him stronger and faster than flesh alone. The duel was brief, almost meditative, a dance they had performed countless times in training now repeated with lethal intent. Luke emerged from the Falcon's docking bay and saw them across the expanse, saw the old man and the dark figure circling each other, and something in him recognized the importance of what was happening, even if he didn't understand it. Obi-Wan saw Luke watching and smiled, a sad and gentle smile filled with acceptance. He raised his lightsaber in a salute, then simply stopped defending himself. Vader's blade swept through him, and Obi-Wan Kenobi disappeared, his robes falling empty to the deck, his body dissolving into the Force itself. No. Luke's scream echoed across the docking bay, raw with grief and shock. He had known Ben for mere hours, but the old man had represented hope, purpose, connection to his father, and the Jedi legacy. Now he was gone, murdered before Luke's eyes by this dark figure who turned toward him with terrible presence. Solo grabbed Luke and dragged him toward the Falcon, firing at stormtroopers who were converging on their position, his blaster laying down covering fire that bought them precious seconds. They scrambled up the boarding ramp, the hydraulics closing it behind them, and Solo threw himself into the pilot's seat, firing up engines even as Luke stumbled to the gun turret in a daze. The Falcon lifted and accelerated, pushing through the docking bay's atmospheric shield and into the void, TIE fighters launching in pursuit, but their heart not truly in it. Luke fired mechanically, his hands operating the guns while his mind replayed Obi-Wan's death, the old man's peaceful smile, his deliberate surrender. Why? Why would he give up? Then he heard it, Ben's voice, quiet and calm, speaking from everywhere and nowhere. Run, Luke, run. The voice was in his head, or perhaps in the Force itself, and Luke realized with dawning wonder that death had not ended Obi-Wan Kenobi. The old Jedi had become something else, something beyond physical form, a presence in the Force that could still guide and teach. It was a mystery beyond Luke's comprehension, but it gave him something to hold on to as grief threatened to overwhelm him. The Falcon fled toward hyperspace, the Death Star making no real effort to prevent their escape, and Luke felt the first stirrings of suspicion even as Solo celebrated their survival. Why had they been allowed to leave? Why had escape been just difficult enough to seem desperate but not impossible? He looked at R2-D2, at the secret plans hidden in the little droid's memory, and wondered if they were carrying exactly what the Empire wanted them to carry, a tracking device, a thread that would lead the Death Star directly to the Rebellion's hidden base. He was right, though he didn't voice his suspicions, didn't want to believe the Empire would be so calculating, would destroy a world and kill millions just to track one escaping freighter. The journey to the Rebellion's base on Yavin 4 was quiet, each of them processing what they had experienced. Leia mourned her world with the stoic grief of a leader who knew the luxury of emotional collapse was not afforded to those who carried responsibility. Solo counted his anticipated reward and pretended not to care about anything except credits. Luke sat in the gun turret and talked to R2, the little droid chirping responses that C-3PO translated, and tried to understand what had happened to him in the space of 2 days. He had gone from moisture farmer to Jedi trainee, had lost his aunt and uncle and his mentor, had saved a princess and witnessed the death of a world, had felt the Force flowing through him and heard a dead man's voice in his mind. His old life was ashes, and his new life was terrifying and purposeless. What was he supposed to do now? Ben had promised to train him, had offered a path forward, but that promise had died with the old man. Luke felt untethered, drifting in a universe suddenly devoid of guidance. Then the jungle moon of Yavin 4 appeared through the viewport, green and lush around a massive gas giant, and the Falcon descended toward the rebellion's hidden base. The great temple was ancient, a massive ziggurat carved from stone by a long-dead civilization, now repurposed by the rebellion as command center and hangar. Rebel personnel swarmed over the Falcon as it landed, technicians and soldiers, pilots and commanders, all working with the disciplined urgency of people who knew the Empire might find them at any moment. Leia was greeted with relief and respect. She was a leader of the Alliance, a princess and senator whose survival was cause for celebration despite Alderaan's destruction. Luke and Solo were processed as auxiliary personnel, given temporary quarters and instructions to report for debriefing. R2 was taken to have his memory downloaded, the Death Star plans analyzed by rebel engineers and tacticians who would look for any weakness they could exploit. Luke wandered through the base, feeling lost, watching pilots prepare for missions, seeing the machinery of rebellion in action. These people were fighting against the Empire, risking everything for the hope of freedom, and Luke felt simultaneously inspired and inadequate. What could he contribute? He was a farm boy who could fly a skyhopper and had received exactly one lesson in lightsaber deflection. He wasn't a soldier or a pilot or anything useful. Then he met Wedge Antilles in the hangar, a pilot checking over his X-Wing fighter, and something in the craft's design called to Luke. The X-Wing was beautiful, sleek and deadly, with 4 laser cannons and proton torpedo launchers, with S-foils that opened into attack position like wings spreading. Luke approached and struck up conversation, his natural friendliness and enthusiasm breaking through Wedge's initial reserve. They talked about flying, about Luke's experience in his T-16 back on Tatooine, and Wedge's expression shifted from skepticism to interest. "You flew a skyhopper through Beggar's Canyon?" he asked. "Those things handle almost exactly like an X-Wing. If you can fly one, you can fly the other." It wasn't exactly an invitation, but it was acknowledgement that Luke might have skills relevant to the rebellion's needs. Luke felt hope stirring for the first time since Ben's death. Maybe he could contribute after all. Maybe his years of canyon racing and womp-rat hunting had been preparation for something more important than he'd imagined. The briefing room, filled with pilots and commanders, all attention focused on the holographic display rotating above the projector table. The Death Star turned slowly, its massive surface mapped from R2's stolen plans, its structure analyzed and picked apart by rebel engineers looking for vulnerabilities. General Dodonna stood at the head of the table, his weathered face grave with the weight of their situation. He explained the Death Star's capabilities, a battle station powerful enough to destroy planets, protected by shields and armor that could withstand any direct assault, defended by thousands of TIE fighters and turbo-laser batteries that could obliterate capital ships at range. It was invincible, or nearly so, but the plans revealed a weakness, a thermal exhaust port only 2 meters wide that led directly to the main reactor. A precise shot into that port would start a chain reaction that would destroy the entire station. It was a ridiculous weakness, a flaw that seemed almost deliberately designed, but it was the only hope they had. The attack would require a squadron of starfighters to make a trench run along the Death Star's surface, dodging turbo-laser fire and TIE fighters, navigating through the station's defensive trenches to reach the exhaust port. Then, a pilot would have to fire proton torpedoes into a target smaller than a womp rat at high speed under combat conditions. The odds were impossible. Many pilots would die. But they had to try, because the Death Star was tracking them, was already in hyperspace headed for Yavin, would emerge in orbit within hours, and would destroy the moon and everyone on it, unless they could destroy it first. Luke volunteered immediately, standing among the gathered pilots and declaring his experience. Some laughed, a farm boy from Tatooine presuming to fly combat missions with Red Squadron and Gold Squadron pilots who had been fighting the Empire for years. But Leia vouched for him, and Dodonna was desperate enough for pilots that he accepted Luke into Red Squadron as Red 5. Luke would fly an X-Wing, would take his place among the rebellion's best pilots, would have his chance to strike back at the Empire that had murdered his aunt and uncle and Ben Kenobi. He felt excitement warring with terror as he suited up in the orange flight suit and white vest of a rebel pilot as he climbed into Red 5's cockpit and familiarized himself with controls that were similar to but more complex than his Skyhoppers. R2 was loaded into the astromech socket behind the cockpit, the little droid chirping encouragement and worry. Around the hangar, other pilots were performing final checks on their fighters' X-Wings for Red Squadron, older Y-Wings for Gold Squadron. Some of these pilots would not return. Statistics and experience said most would not return, but they climbed into their fighters anyway, because the alternative was extinction. Han Solo appeared while Luke was running through his pre-flight checklist, the smuggler having collected his reward for Leia's rescue and loaded it onto the Falcon. He was leaving, taking his credits, and running before the Empire arrived, and Luke felt bitter disappointment at the abandonment. He had thought maybe Solo was becoming a friend, maybe even a believer in something larger than himself, but the smuggler's true nature was avarice and self-preservation. "Take care of yourself, Han," Luke said, trying to keep judgment from his voice. "That's what you're good at." Solo bristled at the accusation but didn't deny it, offering platitudes about Luke being a good pilot and telling him to watch himself. Then the Corellian was gone, walking toward his ship with Chewbacca, and Luke was alone with his fear and his duty. The fighters launched in waves, climbing away from Yavin 4's green canopy and into the black of space, forming up in attack groups. Luke flew Red 5 with a precision that came from years of canyon racing, his hands steady on the controls, his breathing measured inside his helmet. The Force was with him, though he didn't consciously recognize it yet, guiding his movements and settling his nerves. The Death Star emerged from hyperspace like doom made manifest, its massive bulk blotting out stars, its surface bristling with weapons that immediately began tracking the approaching rebel fighters. The attack commenced with Gold Squadron making the first trench run, their older Y-Wing fighters heavy with proton torpedoes and ion cannons, flying in formation toward the exhaust port's trench. Imperial TIE fighters swarmed to intercept, their twin ion engines screaming, their laser cannons spitting green death at the rebels. Gold Squadron took casualties immediately, fighters exploding into debris as TIE fighters overwhelmed their defenses. Luke watched from above, flying escort pattern with Red Squadron, engaging TIE fighters that broke through to attack the Y-Wings. His targeting computer painted enemies across his heads-up display, and Luke fired his laser cannons with the same instinct that had guided his womp rat hunting, leading targets and adjusting for relative velocity. A TIE fighter dissolved into flame and shrapnel under his guns, then another, and he heard Wedge's voice over the comms congratulating him on good shooting. But Gold Squadron was being decimated. Their leader, Gold Leader, made it to the exhaust port and fired his torpedoes, but the shot missed, impacting the trench wall instead of the port. He pulled up and tried to escape, but TIE fighters caught him. His Y-Wing exploded in a bloom of orange fire, and the mission fell to Red Squadron. Red Leader Garvin Dryas, a veteran pilot with calm authority, took command and organized the trench run. Red Squadron would dive into the Death Star's surface trenches, following the channels carved between defensive towers and weapons emplacements, flying toward the exhaust port, while TIE fighters pursued and turbolasers filled the space around them with lethal energy. Luke followed Red Leader into the trench, the massive walls rising on either side of his fighter, the targeting computer showing distance to target counting down kilometer by kilometer. Behind them, 3 TIE fighters pursued with predatory focus, not the standard TIE pilots, but something more dangerous, more skilled. The lead fighter flew with a precision that spoke of exceptional ability, and Luke felt a cold presence through the Force, something dark and malevolent focused on the rebel fighters with murderous intent. It was Darth Vader, the Dark Lord who had killed Ben Kenobi, now hunting rebel pilots with personal attention. His wingmen flew in perfect coordination, and together they systematically destroyed Red Squadron's rear guard. Rebel fighters exploded one by one, their pilots' screams cutting off abruptly as vacuum claimed them. Red Leader reached the exhaust port and fired, but his torpedoes impacted just wide of the target, the shot close but not close enough. He tried to pull up, but Vader's guns found him, and Red Leader's X-Wing came apart in a fireball. Luke was now the last hope, flying with Wedge and another pilot as wingmen, the three of them racing down the trench while Vader and his wingmen closed from behind. Luke's targeting computer was active, calculating firing solutions, measuring distance to target, counting down to the moment when he would have a lock and could fire his torpedoes. But Vader was faster, more skilled, eliminating Luke's wingmen one by one despite their evasive maneuvers. First one exploded, then Wedge took a hit that forced him to abandon the run, his fighter pulling up and out of the trench trailing smoke from damaged engines. Luke was alone, racing toward the exhaust port with Vader closing on his tail, the Sith Lord's targeting computer painting Red 5 with a perfect firing solution. Luke watched his own targeting computer, waiting for the lock, needing just a few more seconds. Then he heard Ben's voice, clear and calm, speaking from everywhere and nowhere. "Use the Force, Luke. Let go. Trust your feelings." Luke made a decision that defied all his training. He switched off his targeting computer, the display going dark, leaving him with nothing but his instincts and the Force flowing through him. The other pilots saw him do it and thought he was insane. How could he hit a 2-meter target at high speed without computer assistance? But Luke wasn't flying with conscious thought anymore. He was flowing with the Force, feeling the moment approaching, sensing the exact relationship between his fighter and the exhaust port, between his torpedoes and their target. Time seemed to slow, the universe narrowing to a single point of crystalline clarity. Behind him, Vader's finger tightened on the trigger, the Sith Lord about to fire and end Luke's life. Then turbo laser fire came from an unexpected angle, destroying one of Vader's wingmen. The Millennium Falcon screamed out of the sun, Han Solo whooping over the comms, his laser cannons blazing. Vader's remaining wingman panicked and veered into Vader's fighter, sending the Sith Lord spinning out of control into space. Solo's voice crackled over Luke's headset. "You're all clear, kid. Now let's blow this thing and go home." Luke fired. The proton torpedoes streaked away from Red 5's launchers, twin points of light racing down into the exhaust port, disappearing into the Death Star's guts. For a moment, nothing happened, and Luke wondered if he had missed, if Ben's guidance had been insufficient or misunderstood. Then the torpedoes reached the main reactor, and the chain reaction began. Luke pulled up hard, his X-Wing climbing away from the Death Star's surface, racing to clear the blast radius. Behind him, the battle station began to die. Fire erupted from the trench, then from other surface features as internal explosions ripped through systems and bulkheads. The entire station shuddered, its weapons falling silent, its lights flickering. Then, it simply came apart, the sphere expanding into a miniature sun of nuclear fire and vaporized metal, a blast wave of destruction that consumed everything within kilometers. The rebel fighters that had survived the battle accelerated to safe distance, watching as the Empire's ultimate weapon dissolved into debris and energy, taking with it thousands of Imperial personnel, but saving billions more who would have died when the Death Star moved on to destroy other worlds. The flight back to Yavin 4 was jubilant, the surviving pilots whooping and celebrating over their comms, unable to believe they had succeeded, that they were still alive. Luke flew with tears streaming down his face, with Ben's presence warm around him like an embrace, knowing the old Jedi Master was proud, was at peace, was still with him in ways that transcended death. Solo's Falcon flew alongside Red 5, the smuggler's cynicism cracked by the reality of what they had accomplished together. They landed to a hero's welcome, the hangar erupting in cheers as the fighters touched down, ground crews rushing to embrace pilots who had faced impossible odds and won. Leia was there, running across the hangar floor with uncharacteristic abandon, throwing her arms around Luke and Han both, her royal composure shattered by relief and joy. Luke held her, feeling connection deeper than words, understanding without being told that she was important to him in ways he couldn't yet articulate. The Force whispered truths he wasn't ready to hear, secrets about family and destiny that would wait for other days. The ceremony was held in the Great Temple's main chamber, a vast space carved from stone and lit by shafts of Yavin's amber light filtering through high windows. The surviving pilots and key personnel formed ranks, while music played triumphant, martial, declaring victory against tyranny. Luke and Han walked down the central aisle in their dress uniforms, approaching a dais where Leia stood in white robes, her hair arranged in elaborate braids, a crown on her head marking her royal status. She moved with grace and dignity, placing medals around their necks, honoring their heroism before the assembled rebellion. Luke looked out at the gathered faces, pilots who had survived the battle, commanders who had planned it, technicians and soldiers who had supported it, and felt overwhelming gratitude and purpose. This was what he was meant to do. This was who he was meant to be. Not a moisture farmer grinding away his life in obscurity, but a hero fighting for something larger than himself. Ben had been right. His father had been right. Whoever Anakin Skywalker truly was. The Force had called Luke away from Tatooine, had given him power and purpose, and he would honor that calling with everything he had. But victory was not an ending, only a beginning. The Empire was vast, spanning thousands of worlds, commanding billions of soldiers and countless warships. The Death Star had been destroyed, but the Emperor remained, and Darth Vader had survived the battle, spinning away into space but not dying, his TIE fighter recovered by Imperial search parties. The Sith Lord would hunt Luke Skywalker with obsessive focus now, driven by something more than duty, by recognition, perhaps, by the stirring of old memories, by the Force showing him fragments of truth he refused to consciously acknowledge. Luke had no family name meaning to Vader yet, was simply the pilot who had destroyed the Empire's greatest weapon, but that would change. The galaxy had shifted on the day a farm boy from Tatooine became a hero of the rebellion, had moved in ways that would echo for years to come. Luke accepted his medal and felt the weight of destiny settling around his shoulders, felt the Force flowing through him stronger than ever, and knew that this was only the first step on a journey that would take him to the very edge of darkness and back. The months following the Battle of Yavin were a blur of combat and training, of missions behind enemy lines and frantic evacuations as the Empire hunted the rebellion across the galaxy. Luke threw himself into the fight with passionate commitment, flying missions that would have terrified him months ago, leading Red Squadron into battles where the odds were always against them but courage and skill could tip the balance. He became one of the rebellion's best pilots, his name spoken with respect in briefing rooms and cantinas, his reputation growing with each successful mission. But piloting alone wasn't enough. Luke felt the Force growing stronger within him, felt powers awakening that he barely understood and couldn't control. Objects would move when he was emotional, drawn toward his outstretched hand by invisible force. He would know things he shouldn't know, would sense danger before it manifested, would feel the presence of enemies through walls and across distances. These abilities were frightening and powerful, and Luke had no teacher to guide him. Ben was dead, existing only as a voice that offered occasional cryptic advice but couldn't provide systematic instruction. The Jedi Order was extinct, its teachings lost or hidden, its masters murdered or driven into hiding so deep that even the rebellion couldn't find them. Luke sought knowledge wherever he could find it. He studied old datacrons salvaged from Imperial archives and black market dealers, fragmentary recordings of Jedi philosophy and lightsaber forms. Incomplete and contradictory, but better than nothing. He practiced with his father's lightsaber in private, running through forms he half remembered from Ben's single lesson, trying to recapture that moment of flow when the training remote had been unable to touch him. Progress was slow and frustrating, full of setbacks and injuries, burns from his own lightsaber when his concentration slipped, bruises from failed telekinetic attempts, headaches from trying to touch the Force consciously rather than letting it flow through him naturally. But he persisted with the same stubborn determination that had driven him on Tatooine, the same refusal to accept limitation that had made him believe escape from moisture farming was possible. The Force responded to his need, opening to him in increments, teaching him through trial and error what no living master could explain. His relationship with Leia deepened into something complex and powerful, friendship mixed with attraction, mutual respect, complicated by unspoken feelings neither was ready to acknowledge. They worked together on missions, her leadership and his piloting forming effective partnership. She would plan operations from command centers while he executed them in the cockpit, their minds working in parallel even when separated by distance. Luke felt drawn to her with an intensity that went beyond simple attraction, felt protective and connected in ways that should have been warning signs, but which he attributed to camaraderie and the heightened emotions of war. Leia felt similar pull toward Luke, but she was pragmatic, where he was impulsive, guarded where he was open. She had duties to the rebellion that transcended personal feelings, had responsibilities to the survivors of Alderaan who looked to her for leadership, and there was Han, the smuggler who had stayed with the rebellion despite his cynicism, who flew missions and cracked jokes and pretended not to care while obviously caring deeply. The three of them formed a triangle of complicated feelings, each connected to the others in different ways, none willing to address the tensions that simmered beneath their friendship. The Empire struck back with systematic fury. Admiral Piet and General Veers led campaigns that destroyed rebel cells and supply lines, that pushed the Alliance from world to world in an exhausting game of hunter and prey. The rebellion retreated to Hoth, an ice planet in the Outer Rim's nowhere reaches, where they could hide in the frozen wastes and regroup their scattered forces. They built Echo Base beneath the glaciers, carving chambers from ice and stone, installing shield generators and ion cannons powerful enough to hold orbit against star destroyers. It was a harsh environment, the temperature outside dropping to lethal cold at night. The wildlife, consisting of wampas and tauntauns creatures, adapted to extremes that would kill humans within minutes. Luke hated Hoth from the first moment, hated the cold that seeped through insulated suits, hated the wind that howled across the tundra like a living thing, hated the constant awareness that exposure meant death. But Hoth was safe, or as safe as anywhere the rebellion could hide, and safety was worth discomfort. Luke was on patrol, riding a tauntaun across the frozen plains to check sensor markers that might indicate meteor impacts or might indicate something worse. The wind cut through his gear, and the tauntaun beneath him was nervous, its reptilian head swinging back and forth as if sensing danger. Luke reached out with the Force and felt something nearby, something large and hungry. He dismounted to investigate a crater, and the wampa struck from behind. The creature was massive, 3 meters of white fur and muscle and claws, its jaws closing around Luke with bone-crushing force. He had a single moment to register shock and pain before darkness claimed him. When consciousness returned, he was hanging upside down in an ice cave, frozen to the ceiling by his feet, his body broken and bleeding. The wampa was nearby, feeding on the remains of his tauntaun, crunching through bone with casual power. Luke's lightsaber lay in the snow several meters away, dropped when the wampa had grabbed him, too far to reach with numb and damaged hands. He was going to die here, frozen and consumed, his body never recovered, his potential wasted. Then he heard Ben's voice again, calm and encouraging. "Luke, use the Force." Luke focused through pain and cold, reaching out with his mind toward the lightsaber, trying to will it toward his hand. Nothing happened. He tried again, concentrating harder, imagining the weapon flying to his grip. Still nothing. The wampa finished with the tauntaun and turned toward him, seeing its captive awake, moving closer with predatory intent. Desperation gave Luke clarity. He stopped trying to force it and instead opened himself to the Force, let it flow through him without directing it, and simply expressed need. The lightsaber moved, sliding through the snow, then lifting into the air and flying into his outstretched hand. He ignited the blade and cut himself free, falling to the cave floor in a heap of bruised flesh and broken gear. The wampa attacked, and Luke's blade swept through its arm, severing limb and ending threat. He stumbled from the cave into the greater cold of Hoth's surface, wounded and freezing, the temperature dropping as night fell. He collapsed in the snow, unable to go further, his body surrendering to hypothermia and trauma. Then Ben appeared before him, not as a voice but as a figure, translucent and blue, a ghost made of Force energy and preserved consciousness. "Luke," Ben said, his form wavering like heat distortion. "You must go to the Dagobah system. There you will learn from Yoda, the Jedi Master who instructed me." It was a vision born of cold and dying synapses, or it was real. Luke couldn't tell the difference anymore. The galaxy spun around him, and Han Solo's face appeared, the smuggler having defied protocols and gone out into the killing cold to search for his friend. Han cut open Luke's tauntaun, the creature having died from exposure during the wampa attack, and stuffed Luke inside its body cavity for warmth, the stench and blood, nothing compared to the imperative of survival. He activated a signal beacon and erected an emergency shelter, and they survived the night through sheer, stubborn refusal to die. The next morning, rescue teams found them and brought them back to Echo Base, where medical droids and Bacta tanks healed Luke's injuries and prevented permanent damage. He woke in the medbay with Leia and Han and Chewbacca gathered around him, their relief palpable, and he told them about his vision, about Yoda and Dagobah, about the training that awaited him if he could only reach that distant swamp world. But there was no time for personal quests. The Empire had found them. Imperial probe droids had landed on Hoth's surface, scanning for rebel bases, transmitting data before they could be destroyed. General Veers was coming with ground forces and AT-AT walkers, and Lord Vader was coming with personal interest in the rebels hiding on this iceball. Echo Base went into evacuation protocols, personnel and equipment being loaded onto transports for desperate flights through the Imperial blockade forming in orbit. Luke climbed into his snowspeeder with gunner Dak Rolter, preparing to buy time for the evacuation, knowing the speeders were no match for Imperial walkers, but having no choice except to try. The Battle of Hoth began with thunder, the massive AT-AT walkers appearing through the snow like mechanical dinosaurs, their laser cannons firing at Echo Base's shield generator, their armored hulls impervious to snowspeeder blaster cannons. Luke led Rogue Squadron in attack runs that should have been suicidal, flying between the walkers' legs, targeting joints and viewports, discovering that direct attacks were useless against armor designed to withstand starfighter-grade weapons. Then Luke remembered something stories of old battles, tactics from the Clone Wars stored in Rebel tactical databases. The walkers' armor was too strong for blasters, but their legs were vulnerable if you could entangle them. Luke ordered his squadron to use their harpoons and tow cables to circle the walkers and wrap their legs until the giants toppled. It was insane, flying low enough that walker fire could swat them from the sky, threading tow cables around moving legs while under fire from both the walkers and ground troops. Dak was killed by a cannon hit that penetrated their speeder's cockpit, leaving Luke to fly and fight alone. But the tactic worked. Walkers fell, crashing to the ice with ground-shaking impacts, their crew compartments crushing or exploding as power systems overloaded. It wasn't enough to win the battle. There were too many walkers, too many Imperial troops, but it bought time for the transports to escape. Luke abandoned his damaged speeder and raced toward the last transport, boarding it just as Imperial troops breached Echo Base's main entrance. The transport lifted under fire, its shields taking hits, climbing toward orbit where Star Destroyers waited. But the Rebellion's ion cannon opened fire from the surface, disabling one of the Star Destroyers long enough for the transport to jump to hyperspace. Echo Base was lost, but the majority of personnel had escaped, and that was victory enough given the circumstances. Luke didn't go with the main fleet to the rendezvous point. Instead, he set course for Dagobah, following Ben's instructions, trusting in visions and the Force's guidance. R2 rode in his X-Wing's astromech socket, complaining in electronic chirps about the detour, warning that Dagobah wasn't on any star charts, that the system was unmapped and potentially dangerous. Luke ignored the droid's concerns and piloted toward the coordinates Ben had provided, emerging from hyperspace near a green world shrouded in fog and mystery. The planet was small, its surface covered entirely by swamp and jungle, no cities or technology visible from orbit, no signs of civilization at all. Luke brought his X-Wing down through the atmosphere, the fighter shaking as it descended through storms, losing altitude faster than he intended as systems malfunctioned in the soup-thick air. He crashed into a swamp, the fighter sinking immediately into murky water, only R2's frantic efforts keeping them from drowning in the cockpit. They made it to shore, a relative term on a world that was mostly water and mud, and Luke set up camp on a relatively dry hummock while R2 attempted to assess the damage to their ship. The swamp was alive with sounds and movement, with creatures chirping and splashing, with bioluminescent plants glowing in the permanent twilight created by the fog. Luke felt the Force here like nowhere else, thick and present, as if the entire planet was steeped in it. He explored cautiously, lightsaber ready, expecting danger around every corner. What he found instead was a creature small and green, with huge ears and ancient eyes, dressed in rough robes and carrying a walking stick. The creature approached Luke's camp with apparent curiosity, rummaging through supplies and speaking in backward syntax that took Luke a moment to parse. "Help you I can," the creature said, his voice crackling with age. "Yes. Help you I will." Luke was disappointed he had come seeking a great Jedi master, and instead he had found this scavenger, this comic relief. He asked about Yoda, and the creature promised to take him to the Jedi, leading Luke on a trek through the swamp to a small hut barely distinguishable from the terrain around it. Inside, the hut was cramped and cluttered, filled with decades of accumulated possessions and cooking equipment. The little creature prepared food while Luke talked about his quest, his training, his need to become a Jedi and fight the Empire. The creature listened and asked questions that seemed irrelevant about adventure, about excitement, about what Luke truly wanted. Then Ben's voice spoke from the Force. "He is not ready." And the little creature responded, "Ready are you? What know you of ready?" Luke's shock was total and embarrassing. This was Yoda, the legendary Jedi Master, 900 years old and powerful beyond measure, reduced to this tiny figure who spoke in riddles and tested Luke with games. Yoda was reluctant to train him, seeing in Luke the same recklessness and impatience that had destroyed Anakin, the same hunger for power without understanding, the same anger simmering beneath good intentions. Ben's ghost appeared, arguing that Luke was their last hope, that the rebellion needed Jedi, that time was running out. Yoda finally agreed, though his misgivings were clear. "This one a long time have I watched. All his life has he looked away, to the future, to the horizon. Never his mind on where he was, what he was doing." The training began immediately and was nothing like Luke had imagined. There were no lightsaber duels, no combat techniques, no flashy displays of power. Instead, Yoda had Luke run through the swamp with the Jedi Master riding on his back, had him balance on one hand while stacking stones with the Force, had him clear his mind and open himself to the Force's flow. It was exhausting and humiliating, full of failure and Yoda's disappointed sighs. Luke tried too hard, wanted too much, let his fear and anger cloud his connection to the Force. When he attempted to lift his sunken X-Wing from the swamp using telekinesis, he managed only to raise it partially before losing concentration and letting it sink deeper. "I can't," Luke gasped, collapsing with exhaustion. Yoda's response was sharp. "No. Try not. Do or do not. There is no try." Then the ancient Jedi demonstrated, raising his hand toward the submerged fighter, and the X-Wing rose from the water like a breaching whale, dripping with mud and vines, floating through the air to settle gently on shore. Luke stared in disbelief at what this tiny creature had accomplished through sheer will and connection to the Force. "I don't believe it," he whispered. Yoda's response was the key to everything. "That is why you fail." Belief, Yoda taught, was the foundation of the Force. Not blind faith but absolute trust in the living energy that connected all things, that bound the galaxy together, that made impossible things possible for those who opened themselves completely. The Force was not a tool to be commanded but a river to flow with, not power to grasp but presence to merge with. Luke's training was as much about unlearning as learning, about releasing his preconceptions and ego, about finding stillness in the chaos of his emotions. He meditated in the swamp for hours, feeling the Force flowing through the ecosystem, through the insects and fish, through the trees and microorganisms, through himself and Yoda and R2. Everything was connected, everything was one, and the distinction between self and other was illusion. When Luke finally grasped this truth, his powers expanded dramatically. He could move objects without effort, could sense the emotions of creatures around him, could feel the future pressing against the present, like water behind a dam. But there was darkness on Dagobah too, a cave beneath a massive tree, a place where the dark side of the Force pooled like oil. Yoda sent Luke there with only his lightsaber, warning him that what he found inside would depend on what he brought with him. Luke descended into the cave with trembling hands, feeling malevolence radiating from the darkness, feeling anger and fear feeding back to him from some source he couldn't identify. Then Darth Vader appeared from the shadows, lightsaber igniting, and Luke attacked without thinking, their blades meeting in showers of sparks. Luke fought with desperate fury, driving Vader back, finally striking a blow that should have been lethal, his blade shearing through Vader's neck, The Dark Lord's helmeted head fell to the ground, the faceplate shattering to reveal Luke's own face staring back at him. The vision was prophetic and terrifying. Yoda had warned that the dark side was quick, seductive, easier than the light. If Luke gave in to his fear and anger, if he struck down enemies from emotion rather than necessity, he would become the very thing he fought against. The cave was showing him possible futures, warning him about the consequences of his choices. Luke's training continued for weeks that felt like months, time becoming fluid in the swamp's eternal twilight. He grew stronger in the Force, more centered and capable, but also more aware of his own darkness, of the anger that simmered in him when he thought about the Empire, about his murdered aunt and uncle, about all the suffering he had witnessed. That anger was power, quick and available, offering strength when lightside meditation took too long. Yoda warned him constantly about the seductive nature of the dark side, how it promised quick solutions but led to enslavement, how it twisted the Force user into something monstrous. Fear leads to anger, Yoda intoned. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. Luke understood intellectually, but struggled emotionally, his youth and trauma making patience difficult. Then, during one meditation session, Luke had a vision not of the future but of the present, occurring in real time across the galaxy. He saw his friends in pain, Han and Leia suffering, Chewbacca roaring in agony, all of them imprisoned and tortured in a city suspended among clouds. The vision was overwhelming, pulling him from meditation with a gasp of horror. They needed him. His friends were in danger, and only he could save them. Luke made the decision immediately. He would leave Dagobah and go to his friends, would interrupt his training to rescue those he loved. Yoda and Ben, appearing as Force Ghost, both objected strenuously. Luke wasn't ready, his training incomplete, his powers insufficient for what he would face. If he confronted Vader now, he would lose, would likely die or worse, would fall to the dark side and serve the Emperor. But Luke wouldn't listen. Couldn't abandon his friends. Felt obligation and love, overriding wisdom and caution. I have to help them, he insisted, and Yoda saw the stubbornness that had characterized all Skywalkers, the refusal to accept others' suffering when action was possible. If you leave now, Ben warned, help them you could, but you would destroy all for which they have fought and suffered. The choice was impossible: abandon his training and potentially become the galaxy's doom, or let his friends suffer and die while he pursued his own development. Luke chose his friends, chose love over wisdom, and Yoda watched him go with profound sadness. Reckless is he, the ancient Jedi sighed. Now matters are worse. Ben's final words echoed as Luke lifted off in his repaired X-Wing. Luke, there is another Skywalker. But Luke didn't hear, was already focused on the coordinates of Cloud City, on reaching Leia and Han before it was too late. Cloud City was beautiful and treacherous, a Tibanna gas mining colony suspended in the upper atmosphere of Bespin, its white towers floating among pink and orange clouds. The city was ruled by Lando Calrissian, an old friend and sometimes rival of Han Solo, a gambler and entrepreneur who had won the mining operation in a card game and turned it into a profitable enterprise. Luke landed his X-Wing on one of the city's platforms and was immediately seized by Imperial troops. The trap was sprung, had been waiting for him specifically. Vader had captured Han and Leia knowing Luke would come to save them, had used Luke's friends as bait to draw him into confrontation. Luke was escorted through the city's corridors at gunpoint, feeling the dark presence growing stronger with each step, knowing he was walking toward death or worse, but unable to turn back. He passed a window and saw his friend's hand frozen in carbonite, a suspended animation in a block of metal being loaded onto Boba Fett's ship for transport to Jabba the Hutt. Leia was screaming, Chewbacca roaring, both restrained by stormtroopers, and Luke felt his heart breaking even as he continued toward Vader. They met in a carbon-freezing chamber, a massive industrial space where Tibanna gas was processed and prepared for shipping. Vader stood waiting, his breathing mechanical and ominous, his presence in the Force like a black hole consuming light. "The Force is with you, young Skywalker," Vader said, his voice deep and distorted by his mask's vocabulator, "but you are not a Jedi yet." Luke ignited his lightsaber, the blue blade casting azure light, and attacked with all the skill Yoda had taught him and all the anger he had been warned against using. Their duel was fast and brutal, Luke channeling fury into his strikes, driving Vader back through the chamber and into the carbon-freezing pit. For a moment, it seemed Luke might win his youth and speed against Vader's augmented strength and experience. But Vader was toying with him, testing his abilities, measuring his potential. The Sith Lord allowed Luke to score minor hits, let him believe victory was possible, then demonstrated the gulf between them. Vader began using the Force, not just to enhance his combat but as a weapon itself, hurling machinery at Luke with telekinetic power, cutting off his escape routes, driving him toward the freezing pit. Luke was knocked off the edge, falling toward the pit where carbonite would encase him as it had Han, but he managed to grab a protrusion and haul himself back up. Vader pursued relentlessly, their lightsabers clashing in showers of sparks, Vader pressing forward while Luke retreated. They fought through corridors and chambers, along catwalks suspended over bottomless shafts, each environment more dangerous than the last. Luke's fear grew as he realized he couldn't win, that Yoda had been right, that he was overmatched and doomed. Vader drove him out onto a gantry overlooking a massive reactor shaft, their blades locked, their faces inches apart, one masked and inhuman, the other young and terrified. Then Vader simply cut through Luke's lightsaber hand, severing it at the wrist in a single economical motion. Luke's hand and lightsaber fell away into the darkness, and Luke collapsed, screaming, cradling the cauterized stump, agony and shock warring for dominance. He was beaten, helpless, at Vader's mercy, and there was no mercy in the Dark Lord looming over him. But Vader didn't kill him. Instead, the Sith Lord spoke words that shattered Luke's understanding of everything. "Obi-Wan never told you what happened to your father." Luke, gasping through pain, managed to respond. "He told me enough. He told me you killed him." Vader's response came with terrible certainty. "No, I am your father." The words hit Luke harder than the physical injuries. Impossible to process, refusing to fit into his conception of reality. Ben had told him Vader killed his father, that Anakin Skywalker had been betrayed and murdered, but Vader was claiming to be Anakin, was saying the man Luke idolized had become the monster he fought against. "No," Luke whispered, denial instinctive and complete. "That's not true. That's impossible." Vader pressed forward, offering dark seduction. "Search your feelings. You know it to be true." And Luke did know, felt the truth resonating through the Force, felt the connection between them that went beyond combat and enmity. Vader was Anakin, his father was alive, and his father was evil. The revelation destroyed something fundamental in Luke, stripped away the naive certainty that had sustained him through his journey. Vader extended his hand, offering alliance. "Join me, and together we can rule the galaxy as father and son." It was temptation and horror combined, the promise of family and power, mixed with the certainty of damnation. Luke looked at the offered hand, at the black glove and the dark armor, and saw his future if he accepted becoming like Vader, powerful but enslaved, serving the Emperor and the dark side until nothing human remained. He thought of Ben, of Yoda, of Leia, of everyone who had believed in him and sacrificed for the rebellion. Then he made his choice. Rather than take Vader's hand, rather than surrender or fight or negotiate, Luke simply let go. He released his grip on the gantry and fell backward into the shaft, plummeting toward the reactor core far below, choosing death over the dark side. It was the ultimate act of faith and defiance, rejecting both defeat and corruption, trusting that the Force would provide some outcome better than what Vader offered. He fell through darkness and machinery, tumbling through levels of the city, until an exhaust vent caught him and deposited him on a weather vane extending from Cloud City's underside, hanging thousands of meters above Bespin's crushing lower atmosphere. Luke clung to the vane with his remaining hand, bleeding and broken, calling out through the Force in desperation. "Ben, Ben, please." But Ben didn't answer, perhaps couldn't answer, perhaps chose not to. Then another voice responded, faint but present. "Luke." It was Leia, hearing him through the Force, though she didn't understand how, feeling his distress and pain through a connection neither had recognized. She was on the Millennium Falcon with Chewbacca and Lando, fleeing Cloud City after rescuing what remained of their team. But she felt Luke calling and demanded they turn back. The Falcon descended through the clouds and positioned itself beneath the weather vane, opening its top hatch so Lando could pull Luke aboard. They fled Bespin with Vader watching from the city above, the Sith Lord making no move to pursue, apparently satisfied that Luke now knew the truth and would be forever haunted by it. The knowledge that his father lived and served evil would eat at Luke, would undermine his confidence and clarity, would make him question everything about his own nature and destiny. The medical frigate, where Luke recovered, was a place of sterile efficiency, its medbay equipped with the best technology the rebellion could afford. Luke lay in a recovery bed, while a surgical droid attached a prosthetic hand to replace the one Vader had taken, the artificial limb covered with synthetic flesh that looked and moved almost like the original. He flexed the fingers experimentally, feeling the mechanical servos responding to nerve impulses, and wondered how much of him could be replaced before he stopped being human, before he became more machine than man like Vader. Leia sat with him during recovery, her presence a comfort even when words failed. They talked around what had happened, Luke unwilling or unable to articulate the full horror of Vader's revelation, Leia sensing his pain but not pressing for details. There was something growing between them. Luke felt it. A connection through the Force that went beyond friendship or attraction, something fundamental that he couldn't name, but which made her presence essential to his emotional survival. He didn't know yet that she was his sister, that the connection he felt was family rather than romance, that the Force was showing him truth he couldn't consciously recognize. Han was gone. Delivered to Jabba the Hutt by Boba Fett, trapped in carbonite, and displayed as a trophy in the Crime Lord's palace on Tatooine. Leia was consumed with plans to rescue him, coordinating with Lando and Chewbacca, reaching out to contacts in the underworld for intelligence on Jabba's security. Luke promised to help, swore they would get Han back, but privately he knew he needed to complete his training first. Vader had defeated him easily, despite all his growth on Dagobah, had proven that Luke was nowhere near ready to face the dark side's full power. He needed to return to Yoda, needed to finish what he had started, needed to become a true Jedi before confronting his father again. The word felt strange even in his thoughts. Father. Anakin Skywalker, the hero Ben had described, the Jedi Knight who had been his father's friend, was Darth Vader, the Emperor's enforcer, the man who had tortured Han and cut off Luke's hand. How did someone fall that far? What could turn a good man into a monster? And more terrifying, if it could happen to Anakin, could it happen to Luke? Was he walking the same path? Was his anger and attachment and fear the first steps toward darkness? These questions haunted Luke as the rebellion regrouped and reorganized, as they prepared for campaigns against the Empire's scattered forces, as Luke flew missions and fought battles while wrestling with existential dread. He meditated as Yoda had taught him, reaching out to feel the Force flowing through all living things, seeking the peace and centeredness the Jedi Master had promised. Sometimes he found it, brief moments of clarity where the universe made sense and his place within it seemed right. Other times he felt only confusion and pain, felt the dark side calling to him with promises of power and certainty, with the seductive lie that anger could solve his problems more efficiently than patience. He walked the line between light and dark, trying to find balance, trying to honor both his training and his emotions. Ben appeared to him occasionally as a Force ghost, offering cryptic guidance and carefully worded truths that avoided the full revelation. Luke wasn't ready to hear that Vader had once been a hero, that he had fallen trying to save someone he loved, that the capacity for both great good and great evil existed in all Skywalkers. The mission to rescue Han Solo took careful planning and multiple stages. They couldn't simply assault Jabba's palace. The Hutt was too well protected, his guards too numerous, his defenses too strong. Instead, they would infiltrate through subterfuge, place operatives inside the palace in different roles, wait for the right moment to strike. Leia went first, disguised as the bounty hunter Boushh, delivering Chewbacca as a supposed prisoner to gain entry and credibility. Lando infiltrated as a guard, blending in with Jabba's mixed security force. Luke would come last, after the pieces were in place, and would negotiate or fight as circumstances demanded. The plan was risky, dependent on too many variables, and the assumption that Jabba would be interested in dealing rather than simply killing them all for his amusement. But it was the best plan they had, and desperation made risk acceptable. Luke had changed during the months since Cloud City, his appearance and demeanor darker, more serious. He wore black now, Jedi robes that reflected his connection to the Force but also his proximity to darkness. His lightsaber was new, not his father's blade lost on Bespin but one he had constructed himself according to Jedi tradition, its crystal synthetic and its blade green rather than blue. The construction had been meditation and trial, requiring Force-sensitive craftsmanship and deep understanding of kyber crystal harmonics. When the blade ignited with its distinctive snap hiss, Luke felt pride and completion. He had created something with the Force, had proven himself capable of Jedi craft. The green blade was beautiful and deadly, and Luke wore it openly on his belt as he approached Jabba's palace, projecting confidence he didn't entirely feel. The palace was a monument to excess and cruelty, a fortress carved into Tatooine's rock, where Jabba held court surrounded by sycophants and slaves, by dancers and droids, by creatures from across the galaxy drawn to the Hutt's power and wealth. Han Solo hung on the wall in his carbonite prison, a decoration Jabba enjoyed showing to visitors as proof of what happened to those who crossed him. Leia had already attempted rescue and been captured, now wearing the gold bikini and chain of Jabba's slave, humiliated but unbowed, her eyes blazing with fury, even as she was forced to recline at the Hutt's side. Luke walked into this den of villainy with his head high and his hand near his lightsaber, using the Force to project authority and power, making lesser beings step aside through nothing but presence. He attempted to negotiate, offering to pay Han's debt in exchange for his friend's release, trying to resolve the situation peacefully as a Jedi should. Jabba laughed, a wet, disgusting sound, and refused. The Hutt had no interest in money. He wanted entertainment, wanted to see these rebels suffer for their audacity. Luke tried a Force suggestion, subtle mind manipulation that worked on the weak-willed. "You will release my friends." But Jabba was strong-minded and experienced with Jedi tricks, waving off the attempt with amusement. "Your mind powers will not work on me, boy." Jabba rumbled in Huttese, his interpreter droid translating. He triggered a trap door, and Luke fell into the Rancor pit beneath the throne room, landing in sand and bones and darkness lit only by firelight. The Rancor was massive, 5 meters of claws and teeth and muscle, a predator kept perpetually hungry for Jabba's entertainment. It grabbed for Luke with hands big enough to crush his entire body, but Luke was faster, rolling and dodging, using the Force to enhance his reflexes beyond human limits. He spotted a gate control panel, and used the Force to pull a rock from the wall, jamming it under the descending gate. When the Rancor came at him again, Luke rolled under the gate and used the Force to collapse the mechanism, sending the heavy door crashing down on the creature's head, crushing its skull. The Rancor's handler wept at the loss, but Jabba was merely annoyed that his entertainment had been so short-lived. Jabba decreed that Luke and his friends would die in the great pit of Carkoon, would be fed to the Sarlacc that dwelt there, a creature that would digest them slowly over 1,000 years. They were transported into the desert aboard Jabba's sail barge, a pleasure craft filled with the Hutt's court, while Luke, Han, and Chewbacca were chained aboard a smaller skiff. The procession moved across the dunes toward the pit, where the Sarlacc waited in.